Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our short webinar on the funding that's available for nonprofit small businesses and others as a result of the CARES Act. My name is Donnie McClurkin. I am Executive Director of the Post Growth Institute. Delighted to have you joining us here. I'm based in Ashland, Oregon. Just want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional lands of the Shasta and Takelma peoples, and that land wasn't ceded. So I'm joining you here from that land and delighted to have you with us as we go through an important process of explaining what is happening in terms of these loans, hopefully making your life a little easier. There'll be opportunity for Q&A. In fact, I'm going to just put in my draft agenda here for those who are joining us. And you're able to see the chat. My plan today is to clarify which loan we're talking about, to talk about the eligibility for that loan, and to discuss some of the details, go through a couple of common questions, particularly how you might calculate the wages that you're looking to include in the loan, questions of ownerships for nonprofits, and then have time for Q&A. So perhaps if you hold off on your questions until the end, that will make probably for the easiest chance for me to get to those questions. I want to start by saying as well that I'm not a lawyer or an accountant, so I don't have any specific expertise in this area other than the fact that I work with hundreds of not-for-profits around the US and elsewhere. I've read all the relevant documentation. I'll be applying for these loans myself. When I say loans, both wearing different hats, both with a nonprofit and as a small business owner. So I can guide you from that basis of expertise. Welcome to those who've just joined us to our webinar talking about how to make the most of the loans programs that are available, particularly the PPP loan we'll get to in just a second, made possible by the government, US government's CARES Act. This call's being recorded and I will be sending that out to everyone who registered, so you'll have a chance to follow up. I'll also be putting relevant links in the chat to anything that may be useful to you in your process of hopefully applying for some of these funds. So to begin, just to clarify, we're talking here and actually wanting to also, before I begin, just acknowledge the great work that so many of you are doing, especially those of you calling in from nonprofits, and to acknowledge that you're probably feeling the pinch financially, that it's a difficult time. And then on top of this, you've got a loan application that you're maybe looking to submit, or maybe you're not even aware of what the loan is that's available. So I'm just acknowledging the stress that might be associated with your circumstances right now. For those of us working in nonprofits, especially frontline service providers, it's an intense time. We're understaffed, we're overworked, and so my heart goes out to you all. And my goal today, by the end of the call, is that you walk away feeling a little more relieved. The headline is that the application process is relatively straightforward. It's quite simple. It won't take long, and there's actually quite low levels of accountability from what I've seen. There is accountability associated with this application, but things like collateral are not required for this loan, which is often an entry point for smaller nonprofits. So let's get into that first agenda item. What loan are we talking about? Because under the CARES Act, which is the government's stimulus program, as they describe it, we talked about $2.2 trillion being available. Specifically here, we're talking about the $349 billion that's been set aside for small businesses, nonprofits, independent contractors, self-employed individuals, and all of these being entities where there's less than 500 employees involved. And I want to make a distinction here between the Paycheck Protection Program, which is covered under what's called emergency SBA 7A loans. I'll just put that in here so we're clear on what we're discussing today. Emergency SBA, SBA standing for Small Business Association, 7A loans. And those are distinct from the existing, what was called the EIDL, which is Economic Injury Disaster Loan. That's a loan that's been around for a long time. In fact, all of these loans, as far as I'm aware, have been around for some time. We saw with Hurricane Katrina, for example, the EIDL loan as part of the response there. And so there is a new piece to the EIDL loan, which is called the SBA 7B loan, and that is the expanded EIDL and emergency grants. That's for groups whose, from memory, where their economic impact of what's happening right now, they can demonstrate that it's been at least 20% of economic injury that the organization or entity has suffered. You're able to apply for that grant. And the interesting thing about that grant is, that loan, is that there's an advance associated with that can be forgiven even if the borrower actually denies the EIDL loan. So they're trying to sort of stopgap organizations or businesses, small businesses that are really struggling. Just to be clear though, today we're talking about a different loan. But there is an intersection point that I want to jump to right now. If you already have an EIDL grant, or you're looking to renegotiate or re-up that grant, there will be a place when you fill in the Paycheck Protection Program loan application that will require you to put those details in. I'm not yet sure, and perhaps someone could put this in the chat if they are clear themselves. If you apply for this Paycheck Protection Program, which I'll explain in just a second, whether or not applying will restrict your capacity to apply separately for the expanded EIDL and emergency grants. That could be the case, and if you are looking to apply for that separately, then I recommend that you talk to someone within a banking institution about whether or not you need to combine those, because it appears that way in the early documentation. So just to recap, there is a Paycheck Protection Program loan that we're talking about today, an expanded expanded economic injury disaster loan that we're not discussing today, and there's also a mid-sized loan program for bigger nonprofits and bigger sized businesses. So to the Paycheck Protection Program, and I'm guessing many of you listening today are familiar with some of these details. Perhaps you even got all the way through the application and are struggling with a piece of it. We'll get to that in this conversation, and as I mentioned, there'll be a chance for Q&A near the end. And thank you to those people who are just joining us. We're here talking about how to avail yourself of the current launched today application process for loans under the Paycheck Protection Program, the Emergency Small Business Association 7A loan. Let's get into what it is. It's essentially a loan that is meant to cover 8 weeks of payroll expenses. There's the capacity for it to include other things, including mortgage repayments, the capacity to include utility bills, but it's essentially focused on payroll. And we'll come back to that in just a moment in terms of what that means. The eligibility, though, let's begin there. It's not just restricted to small nonprofits under 500 employees and small businesses. It also includes independent contractors, self-employed individuals, and what's important to note is that the application that launched today, as far as I'm aware, that application is for small businesses and nonprofits. And on April 10th, we will see the launch of the application process for individuals who are independent contractors and self-employed individuals. So LLCs today can actually can apply as of today, but if you're an independent contractor or self-employed individual, you'll need to wait until the 10th of April for that application to open up. And I'm noticing there's some questions there. I'll be coming back to those and circling back as we go, near the end of our call today. All right, so moving into the description of the PPP a little more. So we have 8 weeks of compensation here. We're looking particularly at something that they changed it, in fact, at the last minute. The interest rate on the loan is 1%, but it's deferred for 6 months. But essentially, as I imagine for most groups tuning into this recorded call, the forgiveness piece is the crucial piece. From what I've read of the documentation, if you either maintain your current employees on payroll, or if you rehire people, and you can actually backdate this back to a date in February if you've already laid people off, and you rehire from this point moving forward, and you maintain or you use those funds that the loan will grant for largely payroll purposes, and it needs to be 75% at least, you will then have, upon verification of providing some documentation to your bank, which will be passed on to the SBA, that loan will be forgiven for your organization or business entity after that hoop has been jumped through. So hopefully here we're looking at essentially a loan that rolls into a grant. If not, the terms of the loan are 2 years with that 1% interest kicking in after the 6-month deferment of the repayment. So it's a very low cost loan anyway. And just to reiterate, it's 100% guaranteed by the Small Business Association, and there's no collateral here. There's no personal guarantees that are required. And there's also no borrower or lender fees that are payable to the Small Business Association. What's really interesting here too is that the banks are essentially helping out the government, because they'll probably come out behind on this one, interestingly, given they're not even looking to recover their costs on the basis of most people, most entities most likely having this grant forgiven. Now, the reason why timing matters is because even though there's $349 billion available here, and there are restrictions on how much each entity can gain. And that restriction is on, let me just go back to the calculation for a second here. So, and there are some nuances involving seasonal workers, etc. But at the end of the day, the amount that you're going to be calculating is 2.5 times an average month for each individual's salaried individual. And that can include all the on-costs, all of the things like sick pay, employee, not employer, employee contributions to their payroll-related services, a whole range of things that can be included there. So given that it's 2.5 times that amount, which sort of factors in that extra bit of, well, if I've got an employee and I calculate their 2 months payroll, their average 2-month payroll, and I'll explain the average piece a little later on. The extra half, 2.5 times that, is to almost say, well, we want to add in a buffer for the reality of extra costs like utility bills, etc. So I'm guessing that's where the 2.5 comes from. But the total that can be given for an individual, recompensated in terms of this loan and the forgiveness piece, is when you calculate an individual person on payroll's salary and you annualize it. So you take that monthly amount that you get to and just multiply it by 12. The total amount is capped at $100,000 per individual. So for those people who are working, for example, in bigger nonprofits that might have a larger salary than that, you're going to be coming down to the 100,000 mark and then dividing that by 12 to get your $8,500 per month amount to be using for your calculation for that individual. Of course, when I'm saying individuals here, you're going to be clumping everything together. If your nonprofit or small business has 10 staff, for example, you're going to be looking at the combined payroll information. And we'll get to, again, some of those questions in a little bit about how you calculate those amounts, to the best of my knowledge, being that I'm not an accountant here. So the other details that are important to know, a lot of the information that you'll find, and I'll show you the links to in a second, goes into some of the specifics about what kind of things can be included in the wage calculation. If you are like me, I run a nonprofit organization called the Post-Growth Institute, and what's fantastic is that we do our payroll as a small nonprofit with 2 employees. We do our payroll through a service called Gusto, And already Gusto, and I'm guessing others may have responded like this as well, other payroll services. Gusto has a section that when we logged in today to our payroll backend, it already said, are you applying for the PPP? If so, choose your dates here for calculating payroll, and it automatically generated the monthly amount for us. So in case you work with Gusto, or you're working, let's say, with QuickBooks or some kind of payroll software, you may want to check if that capability is already set up, because it made my life as easy as clicking a few buttons, finding the amount for the average monthly, and plugging that straight into the form that I'll get to in just a second. Let's talk about those calculations because it is a little bit tricky. Especially, I've had some questions come through via email in advance to this, people asking about, well, we have part-time employees, we have people who are seasonal, we have a combination of different kinds of employees. And again, to reiterate, I'm not an accountant, I'm not an HR specialist, but my understanding of things is as follows. The Treasury with the SBA has made the following accommodation. They've said here, and I quote, and this is from the Treasury information that you will see on the application, to which I'll link you in just a second. The Treasury says this, I'll read the whole paragraph in fact. For purposes of calculating the average monthly payroll, most applicants will use the average monthly payroll for 2019. So if you've seen anywhere that you want to backdate it from 12 months beginning April 1st, I would say, from what I understand, ignore that unless you have a new business. The official directive that I'm reading is it's your 2019 payroll that we're going to be basing this off. And even if you haven't filed your taxes yet, they're still going to be needing to see some kind of, maybe that you need to file your taxes first, because when we get into the application, certainly with the bank that I'm working with, Road Credit Union, they're asking for a 940. And a 941, sorry, which is more relevant in terms of your quarterly tax payments. So here the Treasury is saying your average monthly payroll for 2019 is going to be relevant for most people, excluding costs over $100,000 on an annualized basis for each employee. So as we just described, there's that cap there for certain individuals. So if you have a mix, if you have a well-paid CEO, for example, over $100,000 with the total package, you're going to need to delve into the details and recalculate that rather than just clicking on your overall payroll data. You are going to need to adjust that from what I understand. Now for seasonal businesses, and this is interesting, this surprised me a little bit. It said the applicant may elect instead to use average monthly payroll for the time period between February 15th, 2019 and June 30th, 2019. Now, I'm an Australian, as you maybe can tell from the accent. I'm not familiar with particular HR matters relating to seasonal workers, but to me, I would imagine that seasonal businesses aren't just during those periods. So I'm not sure what that means in terms of other nonprofits, small businesses that have seasons that are outside that time period, other than it suggests that you take that time period no matter what. I would guess that if you're unsure as to what to include in terms of people's wages and when, because you want to calculate something, if you have individuals, let's just be clear here, if you've got individuals who don't work for the whole year or part-time casual labor, you're trying to work out a snapshot of when they are at their typical working arrangements. So I would guess that your best bet is to talk not with an accountant so much as with the bank that you're going to need to interface with here to discuss that piece of it. What I understand is that if you have a mix of seasonal and full-time, part-time employees, that you're going to be working out a combination of these things and trying to merge them in some way that gives you a reasonable average monthly amount. I could be wrong on that. But that's my understanding. You've got your, let's say, your full-time employees. I'm going to use the year, divide that by 12, and then as long as the cap of the 100,000 is factored in, and then I've got my seasonal employees. I'm going to work out using the calculation there for the time that they're seasonally employed. I'm going to then divide that, and then I'm going to merge those two in, would be my guess. But again, I'm encouraging you to talk to your financial institution, and you're going to want to talk to a business relationships manager there about that. Thank you to those who are just joining us. We're on our call talking about the nonprofit and small business loans, also available to self-employed individuals and contractors on a later basis. As mentioned earlier, those individuals in the latter circumstances can apply on April 10th is when self-employed individuals will have access to this kind of loan. There is one other category that we need to look at here, and that's for people with new businesses. The average monthly payroll here, according to the directive, is calculated using the time period January 1st of 2020 until February 29th of 2020. And again, excluding annualized costs of over $100,000 per employee. So those are the time frames of things here in terms of how you're assessing your wages. Some of you may need assistance in that, and again, I recommend going to the lending institution first here, and then to an accountant, because I suspect an accountant is only going to do what you would be doing by going to the bank first to get clarity, or looking on Treasury, and they're not going to read anything more than what I've just read there, because that's part of the application itself that I've just read from. So let's move to that part of here. I'm going to share my screen and just give you an example of the application process so you can see it. It'll be a little different with each bank. Some banks I know will most likely favor individuals who do their business banking with the organization, with the banking entity itself. So if you run a nonprofit with a bank, but you don't have a personal business banking account, it may take you a little longer. I guess time will tell on that front. But I want to just show you what the bank that I bank with personally, Road Credit Union, has done. Let me just pull that up here. I'm going to find the, oops, 1 second there while I just get myself set up with the page here. There we go. And over to the credit unions page. Okay. So if we go to credit union here, and a lot of banks haven't opened their application as of an hour or so ago, but there are news of more and more banks making their application available. So you see here in my bank that just got a little notice about that. I'm going to click on Learn More here. And it will take you, as probably with other groups, to some kind of page that will outline both the general information. Here's the background information that you can read through if you want to know any more detail, many of which I've just summarized now. And then you'll see here there's a PPP application. We'll click on that in just a second. That will be the standardized application as far as I'm aware for everyone. I'm not sure if they will modify the application as of April 10th for self-employed individuals, so stay tuned on that one. But you'll see here that Road Credit Union is saying you're going to need your Form 940, which is your federal unemployment tax, and your Form 941, which is your quarterly tax filings. Now, for most nonprofits that I'm aware of, they're FUTA exempt. So I'm not sure what you would do other than to maybe, when you email through this application or fax it through, to just make a note that you are FUTA exempt. You don't file the 940, but you will need to put in your quarterly 941s there. So let's just have a look at the application here. You'll see there the URL. In fact, I'm going to just copy that in before we proceed here into the chat. Let me just jump back over to the chat there. Where are we? Oh, I need to stop my sharing for a second. Put that into the chat. There's the URL for the application that anyone can look at right now as well. I'm going to jump back into the share screen here, and we'll have a look at the Rogue application through Rogue. So I'm going to continue to the site, and you'll see it actually opens up a PDF, the same one that you have in the chat that I just shared with you. What's great is it's a very simple 2-page application. I'll just show you the 2 pages here, and then you'll see underneath the 2 pages is some information. There's actually not that much information there, just a little, and then it goes into the typical government acts around privacy, paper reduction, etc. But if we start at the top, we're going to just work our way through here. You're going to select which entity. In this case, we're talking mainly about nonprofits. If you've got a doing business as, you're going to put that in there, of course. Your legal name. All of this is pretty straightforward for those who fill in these documents a lot. Here's that average monthly amount. That's the amount you will need to work out, and then multiply that by 2.5. And you'll see here what I mentioned early on is that if you do have an existing economic injury disaster loan that you're looking to either expand or re-add in, you'll need to add that in. But for most of you, I'm guessing that won't be the case. And so you're just going to multiply this by 2.5, add in the amount of employees that you had throughout the year at any one point. And you're going to put in here whatever's relevant for you, most probably payroll. And if you have any of these other things here, I really recommend just focusing on payroll, even if you do have these other expenses, just because it's going to make the paperwork a lot more easy. And the reality is, I'm sure you can all spend 2 months worth of payroll over a longer period of time, and that should be fine as well. Now, if you're a nonprofit in here, you're just going to leave it blank or put NA or put the words nonprofit because, of course, under law, you don't have any equity owners. For small businesses, you're going to put your own name in there, and or whichever business partners you have, etc. There's detailed advice on that in the Treasury guidelines that they have shared. Now, let's just go through most of these. I'll let you read through at your own point here, but just so you know, it's not one of these cases where everything is no, 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 no. There are a couple of things you want to check in with around whether or not you've received certain loans before. And this one here almost caught me up. It said, is the applicant or any owner of the applicant an owner of any other business or have common management with any other business? Now, I run a nonprofit. I'm a volunteer for that nonprofit, in fact, but I am an owner of another business, which is my LLC. So I had to add an addendum A. It was literally, I think I can just pull it up here for you all. Let's have a look here. There it is. I just wrote it up, and I don't know if this is how it should appear, but I just wrote this. The applicant, Donald McClurkin, is the sole owner of this other business. There is no connection between the nonprofit and the other business. So who knows if that's ultimately what they're going to require in terms of that addendum. But it is important to note that if you work for a nonprofit, you're applying for a nonprofit, and you own another business, you probably need to add that addendum in there. The other one that sort of tricked me up a little bit here was, so these were all for me, no, no, no. Just this one, just keep an eye on this. Is the United States the principal place of residence for all employees? If it is, most likely is the case, then you're going to click yes on that one. Crucially, you can't be paying contractors here. You can't be paying people overseas in any way, shape, or form. Yeah, the rest, that's the end of that. You're going to sign off on this. You're just going to initial down here. And this is one last piece before I come over to some of the questions. You're going to put your name, date, title, the usual in there. But here you're going to need to put a signature in. And it's tricky because in my case, I'm using Acrobat. I needed to go through a process of setting up a digital signature, not something that I've done before. Normally, I just print these things out or find some way to type it in. The problem with printing it out is when you come back to the application here, the information, like if you put in your EIN or social security or an address, for example, or even there are certain spots where it's going to flow over and there's not enough space. So printing it out is a little problematic. So I think what most people, especially small businesses, are going to need to do, where you're going to be putting ownership information in, is actually work out a way, if depending on the software you're using, maybe if you're not using Adobe, you'll be okay, but you're going to probably need to find a way to actually put a digital signature in here in the application. All right, I'm going to jump to questions in here at the moment. Let me just check first of all. Vicky was saying, can anyone see it on the screen? I'm still looking at the same one before. So if you weren't able to follow the screen share for some reason there, hopefully you can click through to the PDF that I shared, and that will oh, I see that you're still seeing the Rogue site on the screen share. Well, apologies, folks. I might have just taken you to the wrong one. So let me just quickly jump over and see if I can change the Zoom here. Let me just try again. I'm so sorry about that. Let me open it up here. I'm going to just share this quickly here let me just check in the chat. Can you all see the, let me just fiddle around here for 1 second. 1 second. It's hard for me to see the chat, so I'm wanting to check in the chat. Here we go, which it's not letting me see. So it's hard for me to know whether or not you can see. There we go. You see the PDF now. Great. Let me just show you that one more time. Apologies for that. Here's the sheet. It's just 2 pages long. This top section where I was mentioning, this is where you're going to put the payroll amounts in. Here's where you're going to say NA for a nonprofit. And here's these forms, these tick boxes. And the 2 questions you want to keep an eye on are this one about the owner of the business, the nonprofit in some cases, if you have another business, just making sure that you're putting this addendum in here that you're going to send through to the bank. And then the last bit here is this digital signature part that you might need to navigate. Those are the 2 trickiest parts that I found in this application. All right, I'm going to jump over to the Q&A here. Richard says, the Paycheck Protection application says certifications. The business and each of 20% or greater owner must certify in good faith to all of the below by initialing next to each one. Current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applicant. I wonder what necessary means. That's a great question. As far as I'm aware, this is going to be on an honorary basis. From all indications, there's not going to be a difficulty here, Richard, in terms of justifying what's necessary. The reality is that I think the de facto is just going to be assumed that if you are paying payroll throughout this period, or you can show after the months that you've gained a loan, that you paid payroll for those periods, then that will satisfy the question of whether it was necessary or not. I think arguably it would be a tough case to make that none of us are needing necessary assistance throughout this broader situation. So to your question about whether or not we could deplete savings and reserves just to keep paying employees, I think that would make that would not negate the necessity of this loan, given ensuring savings and reserves are an important part of financial prudence anyway. The question here is, would I go over the eligibility for small businesses without employees, just oneself, from Alea? So Alea, let's just clarify that if you're talking about a self-employed individual, we're not yet sure about the guidance on that particularly. It could change is what I'm understanding, and that will happen when closer to that application date being launched for self-employed individuals and contractors on April 10th. But for people who have LLCs, the eligibility for those businesses is exactly the same as anyone else. So essentially, if you can, in good faith, say, So if you have an LLC and you're paying yourself a wage out of a disbursement from that LLC, you're going to be looking back at the payroll in terms of that LLC, the disbursements made over the year, averaging that out, same situation, and that necessity that Richard was alluding to, that you're signing off on, is just going to be the same thing. If you're continuing your LLC right now, let's say your small business with just one employee, then you are going to be able to say, look, to continue paying payroll, this is how I was able to proceed, was with this loan. You'll probably need to show that payroll data to SBA and or the bank after the 8 weeks period of any loan being given in order to justify it, or maybe even a little later on down the track if it takes a little longer to use those funds. The next question here was from Ginny. Is the number of employees the number of persons employed or their combined FTE, full-time equivalent? That is a great question, and I'm not entirely sure. I wouldn't want to misguide you, so let me just see if I can see anything in the documentation I have here, Ginny, around that. My guess is that it would be FTE equivalent, but I could be wrong there, so don't quote me on that. I'm just sourcing through the documents here. I can't see anything about that. And so probably the best thing to do would be to type that into Google and just have a look and see whether the FTE piece is being added in there. And I'll keep looking for this in just a second in case it pops up. Or if anyone else knows, please feel free to put that in the chat. Kathy asks, can I apply for an employee I would hire because I cannot do events live? Could I pay for a tech person to support my doing classes online? As a nonprofit or a small business at this point, you can apply for an employee. Yes, if you add them to payroll, as long as they're not a contractor. This PPP loan does not cover contractors. So as long as you hire them and put them on payroll, there's nothing stopping, as far as I'm aware, the expansion of your employment right now. I could be wrong. It does talk about continuation of employment and rehiring, but my understanding is that you might be able to make that work. I could stand corrected on that. So that might require a little bit more research, and certainly more research than I've done at the moment. It is a great question. Again, for all of these questions, I would be looking to the SBA, Treasury, and official guidance, maybe also provided through your banking institution. Alea asks, so since she's paid by client session, not on payroll or LLC, it's uncertain if we're covered. No, the short answer is you'll most likely have an opportunity to apply, but that will be a different application process that launches on April 10th. So you want to look out. It sounds like what you're describing, Alea, is given you're not on payroll and you're not an LLC, you're a self-employed individual, probably a sole proprietor from what I'm understanding. And in that case, that you'll be gaining guidance on that, and the application for that will launch on April 10th through SBA approved lending institutions, which there are many, and it extends to credit unions as well as commercial banks, for-profit banks. I'm going to go to the other questions here. Ed asks, if employees are choosing to PTO currently, can they be paid back to regain PTO? Ed, I'm not quite sure what PTO means. I assume that means like pay you later or delay a payment. My understanding, if that's the case, and feel free to put a clarification in the chat, is that there's absolutely the ability to catch up on wages. I mean, from what I understand of this, folks, there's a lot of flexibility here in terms of when you actually make the payroll that on the basis of which you're using to have the loan forgiveness. Oh, thanks, paid time off. That makes sense. That is a great question. There is something in here about that. Let me just have a look here. Um, I'm pretty sure, because it definitely includes sick pay, sick leave. And let me just check here. I had something written about that. I can't quite see it, but I believe it includes any type of leave that is associated with what's happening right now. You should be that should be eligible for repayment through this loan, and therefore qualify you for the forgiveness of the loan. Nicole asks, I'm only a 5% owner of 2 other businesses. Should I still add it on the PDF as well as Addendum A? Nicole, my understanding is you'll need to add it on the Addendum A if you're putting in for a nonprofit, for example, or for multiple applications. The actual question about the percentage, though, is interesting. From memory, it's 20%. So you're going to list all owners of 20% or more equity of the applicant. And so you wouldn't need to put your, someone else wouldn't need to put your 5% ownership on their application for their business. But for filing for your own entities, I would recommend you put the Addendum A elsewhere. It might not technically be required, but I would say it's certainly not going to cause you any harm to disclose that, from what I understand. All right, Abram says, just joining in. Is this being recorded? Absolutely. We're recording this, and we'll send through a copy to all of the registrants. Another question from Abram. How about funding for specific projects that are underway, such as, and he puts a link into to a project, a film conversation with young men. So Abram, this is not, we're talking here about the Paycheck Protection Program, which is different to the expanded economic injury disaster loan and other loans that you might have seen. So here we're talking specifically about payroll. So if the project that, let me put this another way. If you apply and you gain the loan, as long as you spend that loan on payroll associated with your organization's running, my understanding is it doesn't matter whose payroll or what payroll, and I could be wrong there. It might need to be continued payroll from before, but my understanding is that you won't have a problem having the loan waived in terms of shifting it over to a grant. We're almost at the end of time here. I'm just going to have a look and see. There's a last question. As a nonprofit, if we write NA for applicant ownership, Ethan asks, which is logical, do I anticipate any confusion when the bank tries to determine which individuals are responsible for the loan? My answer to that is no, because at the bottom of the form, you are still signing off to say who is the applicant or the individual associated with the application. So they'll still have a name, even if you're applying for an entity. So I would just keep that blank. I would put in nonprofit rather than NA, just to make it super clear. But of course, remembering in that form at the very top, it gives you the opportunity to select nonprofit. It's just that the US system has never been good at accommodating this ownership piece. Those of you who do this regularly in the nonprofit space know that, like in workers' compensation, it's the same thing. They'll often ask you for who are the owners, and you're like, there aren't any owners, we're a nonprofit. I'm going to just take these last new 2 questions here, and then we'll wrap up. So the question from, let me check who it's from, Daya. Could you verify if my payroll will be determined for my profit from my taxes if I am a married LLP? So a limited liability partnership. That's a great question. I'm not an expert in that area, so I'm not sure how partnerships are going to be assessed. I assume that, let me just see if I understand your question correctly. Yes, so my understanding is whatever the disbursements were that were made to you in that LLP, remembering that the LLP will most likely have retained some money, maybe it's made an owner payout, etc. We're not talking about those ownership dividends. We're talking here about what the payroll was. So you'll be looking at your payroll. The LLP will no doubt be applying for one application here, combining whatever the members are, as far as I understand it. And the way you'll work that out is you'll be combining the payroll, even of your spouse, for example, into that application as payroll expenses, and listing the multiple payroll employees on the application. And the last questions here, if we can just hold off on the questions, folks, because we're needing to wrap up, so we'll just close the questions there, and I'll get through these last ones. Kathy asks, is it a problem if you do not have any employees beforehand? Yes, that is going to be a problem. So if you are an organization that was established, or a business that was established in 2019, but did not have any employees or payroll for 2019, then you won't be eligible here, is my understanding, because you won't have any statistics on which to base your average monthly income, even if you started paying yourself this year. Now, there might be exceptions that I'm unaware of, but I think you're going to hit a problem if that's the case. So unless you're a new organization that came online as a registered entity in 2020, you will have some challenges there in terms of how you're going to assess the monthly income. So Wyatt says, is the applicant the nonprofit or the executive director filling out the application? That's a great question, Wyatt. My understanding is that the applicant is technically the nonprofit, but for certain purposes, and they might just not have done a really good job of clarifying this, and they might be confused themselves. The applicant, when it comes to that question about whether the applicant has other business interests, will need to be you, probably. And I could be misreading this. Maybe the applicant is the nonprofit in this case, and that's why an addendum is more related to whether the nonprofit owns other businesses. I would guess not, because I'm guessing that they're wanting to see which individuals, where individuals applying for money here to ensure that there's not any double up or sort of sneaky business. I hear what you're saying, that it looks like the person filling out the form is the authorized representative. It may be that that's the case. You're probably right that, again, for the legal purposes, the applicant is the entity, because in the US, a corporation is it in itself an entity unto its own, and it's probable that the applicant is an authorized the individual signing off is the authorized representative. I just read the applicant piece of that question as the individual, just to be safe. Again, I might have misread that technically. I don't think it's going to be too problematic. So this last question here from Abram, does payroll have to be for an employee? Yes. There's no contractor payments that are included here. So if you do 1099s, these sorts of things, or if you contract yourself and hire, unfortunately, this won't be applicable to you at this point. However, come April 10th, you will be able to apply for the self-employment angle, and that will maybe a slightly different process. We're not sure yet, but that application is being held off. It's probably going to be exactly the same, because they've already got the box at the top to tick for those options, but they're going to process those secondarily. And their thinking, I'm guessing, is let's get the small businesses moving and move to the smaller fish, so to speak, a little later. That's unfortunate. I'm sorry for all of you in that boat. And I can empathize as someone who's also in a situation where that has impact. But just letting you know that you won't be able to apply for that just yet as a self-employed individual or contractor. And that's it. Thank you so much for joining us today, folks. As mentioned, we'll be sending this out. I'm just going to put the details of our organization, if you're interested, in the chat here. I work with the Post-Growth Institute. We help organizations, particularly nonprofits and socially oriented small businesses, with their activities. We help with everything from strategy, consulting in terms of marketing, startup, the whole lot. And if we can ever be of assistance, we offer that as a professional service, as a way to fund our work, which is also focused on bigger economic pictures. So I hope you have great success with this application, that you're eligible and you can move forward. It looks like a great opportunity to get some funding in for groups that were, like many of us, already challenged before this hits. And again, my heart goes out to all of you doing such important work in communities. Keep going. We need each other. We need to support each other through this. Feel free to reach out to myself or my organization if you're needing further direct assistance through our professional consultancy. And thank you so much for being with us here today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day and stay safe, everyone.